We're joined now by Van Hipp Jr., who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Army. He joins us from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Hipp. President Trump had said, quote, help is on its way. Now we're looking at a scenario in which there's be more sort of restraint. And I'm wondering why you think this is. What's changed?
I don't know if it has changed. I think these next 24 hours, Tom, are very critical. But I think what you're seeing here, and there's some good intel coming out, that last night the Iranian regime thought that a U.S. strike was imminent. And when they did that, they showed their emergency protocols to our intel authorities. And by that, I mean their escape routes, where their leadership would hide, and what frequencies they might use in an emergency. So they exposed those emergency protocols. And what President Trump, why that's important, what President Trump has said he wants, if we do undertake military action, he wants it to be swift and decisive. And I mean, look, this is an international chess game, and anyone who's watched President Trump knows he plays 3D chess while others play checkers.
Right. So we've got President Trump saying we're in sort of wait and see mode, so to speak, not ruling out force. But from what you're saying, this could actually be strategic ambiguity, or it could be preparation for a surprise attack. What do you think is more likely at this stage?
I think so. I think this president is not afraid to use military force, and this regime is teetering. So I think the intel that we got last night when those emergency protocols were revealed is very important. And Tom, I would go back to 2020 when the regime was also teetering. And President Trump issued a very dire warning to Iran at that time. And he said point blank, we've identified 52 targets inside Iran, 52 targets representing the 52 Americans who were held hostage when they seized our embassy in Tehran in 1979. So I think, and the president said he's getting briefed every hour on this. He's got good options. And we've just learned in the last hour or so that the USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike force is now headed to the region.
Right. And do you think there is a sense in the Trump administration that the opportunity for what you described as a decisive strike might not come around for quite some time? And if the protest movement fades away, the opportunity might not present itself again during President Trump's time in office. Do you think that's part of the calculation?
I think it is, but I think what is driving this right now is what President Trump has said. It's got to be swift and decisive. You can't have a situation where the regime is just severely crippled. You cannot let them up for air this time. And the people there, they've had it. I mean, you've got 48% inflation, 58% food inflation, water shortage, and Tom, it is the rial. The Iranian dollar is worthless. It takes 1.4 million rials to equal $1 US right now.
Right. We've heard President Trump talking about, what might come after the administration in Tehran. He doesn't sound very enthusiastic, shall we say, about Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah. Do you think the United States does want a change of leadership in Iran?
Well, there are reports, though, that Trump administration officials did meet with the Crown Prince this last weekend. And I would say this, if you look at what groups outside of Iran want and what they've advocated, even groups that don't get along with each other, be it MEK, Reza Pahlavi, and others, they all want the same thing. They want self-determination by the Iranian people, and they want a secular democracy. So I think all these groups, even though they may be at odds, they want the same thing at the end. And I would say this too, the Iranian regime is not just, when you look at all they've done there in that part of the world, their reach in sponsoring terrorism has really been worldwide. And don't forget, 11 Arab nations have gone to the United Nations declaring Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. And I would also remind your viewers, look at the North Korean nuclear threat today. Where do you think that came from? Their nuclear program, their ballistic missile program, if you take the Shahab missile out of Iran and compare it to the Taepodong in North Korea, lo and behold, it's the same missile. And back in 2011 and 2012, I used open source intelligence to reveal then that the Iranians were on the ground in North Korea, helping them with the ballistic missile program and the nuclear program. So a a secular democracy in Iran would certainly make the world a much safer place.
And yet, seen from a regional perspective, some of the United States' Gulf partners have expressed, let's say, some reservations about a military strike on Iran. And I'm just wondering, from a regional perspective, what's more risky here, regime collapse or regime survival?
Well, also, I would say that our allies in the region, they may say one thing to the press in the open, and they say something else privately. Don't forget, 11 of those Arab nations, like I said earlier, have gone to the United Nations and declared Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. That tells us all we need to know.
How fragile do you think the leadership looks right now?
I think it's fragile, but we've seen it before. We've seen it in 2009. We've seen it in 2020, and I quite honestly believe I go back to where it was in 2020, and it was teetering once again. And I think had President Trump been president instead of Joe Biden, it would have already collapsed. But I go back also to the 2009 uprising of the people there. And what really drove a lot of this, Tom, is we had 6 U.S.-based Farsi TV stations that had a pro-democracy values type message to the young people. It had a profound impact. And one thing I've advocated for years is more Farsi-speaking communications, media outlets to communicate directly to the people of Iran.
Do you think we're basically looking at a diffused crisis or the calm before a serious confrontation? I think I can guess where you might be heading from what you said earlier.
I think it's a coin toss, but that's the beauty of this president. He keeps them guessing. He keeps his adversaries guessing, and he has. You know, when Donald Trump first got elected, people thought, well, his weakest area would be foreign policy. I say it's probably been one of his strongest suits.
Do you think the president feels somewhat emboldened by some of the foreign policy operations that are being carried out already in 2026? And of course, I'm thinking of Venezuela.
They've been effective, and again, you know, he's gone in. He's not expanded the mission. He's focused on it. And this president, I mean, you know, when you undertake any kind of military action, he takes this very seriously, and he's and very deliberative. And that's why he tasked the Pentagon, give me options, but it's got to be a swift and decisive strike. And I think he takes his responsibility seriously as commander-in-chief. And I think one of the most important responsibilities as commander-in-chief is to protect the American people, to provide for the common defense, to protect the American people, to keep us safe. When he looks at their influence that they've had in this country, we've been illegal aliens and nefarious characters from adversarial nations pouring into our borders, you name it. He's taken these steps to keep this country safe.
Do you think Israel is in close contact with the Trump administration at this moment and perhaps offering advice? Is that advice listened to?
Israel's a great ally, and I have no doubt that our folks are in touch with the Israelis as well as other allies in the region.
Okay, and
don't forget the strikes we carried out against ISIS targets in Syria recently were with other allies in the region as well.
Okay, I mean, if indeed these 3 weeks of unrest are drawing to a close, does that essentially mean the window for action is starting to close?
Not necessarily, but I do think this next, I'd say 24, 36 hours are absolutely critical. Absolutely critical.
Okay, and what's your hunch as to how things will pan out in the next, say, couple of weeks, couple of months?
Well, I hope, I mean, we have to learn from history. And when you're dealing with thugs and like the Ayatollah and the thugs that he's surrounded by, I think you have to understand that any kind of deal, I mean, look what they've done with the IAEA and how they've lied about their uranium enrichment programs. Any kind of deal you have with them is as worthless as the deal that Neville Chamberlain got with the Nazi regime right before World War II.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed, Van
Thank
Hip
you.
Jr. Thank you, sir.
Good to be with you.
Well, we're joined now by Richard White, who's a security analyst and senior fellow at the NATO Defence College. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. White. President Trump has been told that the executions in Iran are now off the table, and that seems to have influenced his decision. And he seems to be moving away from the idea of carrying out any military response to what's been happening in Iran. How credible do you think it is, this claim that the executions are indeed not going ahead?
Right. Well, both President Trump and the Iranian foreign minister have made that claim. And what's obvious from this is you can basically verify it fairly quickly. If there are executions, they normally are put in public, but even if they were in private, the families would know and release that information. And I think it makes sense that this way President Trump can claim, well, he stopped the executions and the Iranian government won't provoke a need for U.S. escalation. So I think this is probably what's going to happen. There won't be any immediate executions.
Okay, I mean, President Trump had said earlier in the week, quote, help is on the way. Why do you think he had the change of heart?
Well, I think several factors were at work. One, the U.S. goals were never defined as the U.S. bringing about regime change itself. If the protesters could do it, the U.S. would welcome that. But President Trump seems more restrained in his ambitions. He seems to want some kind of, as he puts it, deal with Iran to govern its nuclear activities, regional policies, and so on. And the protests helped achieve that. At least they put more pressure on the Iranian government and made clear that unless they solve their economic problems, they're likely to continue. And then there was a capacity problem. The U.S. doesn't have a lot of forces in the Gulf at the moment. It could launch maybe an initial wave of strikes, but the carriers, there's none of them are there. A lot of the forces of the U.S. would normally have in the Gulf are off Venezuela. So I think it was a prudent balance of goals and means, and that's kind of what the U.S. could achieve and how to do it.
Well, of course, Israel is a country that's carried out strikes on Iran, and they seem to have pretty razor-sharp intel when it comes to what's happening on the ground in Iran. I mean, could Israel perhaps take matters into their own hands?
That is possible. There are reports in the U.S. media that the Israelis and Iranians exchanged communication through the Russians acting as intermediaries, saying they didn't intend to attack each other on this crisis. I think that, Israel started the June war last year. It could attack Iran again. It's not clear, how the President Trump would react. He's certainly very responsive to Israeli security concerns, but he's also very responsive to the security concerns of his Gulf partners. And as far as I can understand it, the countries in the Gulf, the leaders of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have all said they don't want a military escalation by the United States or Israel. So I would think that would have a greater impact than President Trump's deliberation and would also restrain the Israelis, given how President Trump reacted when they attacked Qatar last year. It triggered a very negative reaction by the White House.
Just looking at the latest reports from Iran, and I know there's been this internet blackout, and we aren't always 100% ahead of the curve when it comes to news out of Iran at the moment. But it does appear that the protests have faded somewhat and dissipated somewhat since Monday. And I'm wondering what you think's at work here. Is that sort of fatigue, or do you think it's fear that's at work?
I have to think it's fear. I mean, we've seen thousands of people being killed on the streets, and threats of hanging were made, even if they're not going to be carried out. And so I think the government forces have suppressed the uprising just using brute force. And I think that if someone were to protest now, there's a real risk for their safety. So I think that that's really what's suppressed much of the protests, at least as we can see them.
Do you think the Iranian leadership is looking more fragile now than it did, say, 3 weeks ago?
Yes. Now, it's true that the Iranian security forces stayed firmly behind the Iranian regime, and that's a big difference between what happened in 1979 when the security forces split. No longer, many of them refused to fire on the protesters, and that led to the toppling of the Shah. Here, the security forces did what they were told, which was to shoot at the demonstrators. And so that is the foundation, which is now the regime. It's more almost a military regime as opposed to a clerical regime. And then, of course, we're entering this precarious period of transition when the supreme leader is replaced by somebody else. So and the suffering economy, which seems to be the main driver to the current wave of protests. So yes, the regime appears to be in a very vulnerable state, more so than we thought maybe a few weeks ago. But what we don't know is this going to mean it will try and make more concessions to get sanctions removed, or does this mean it'll hunker down at least for a few years until it's reestablished firm control, there's a new leader solidly entrenched in office, and so on?
It's very hard to see how they can address those economic grievances because there are some pretty long-standing, deep-seated economic problems in Iran. Plus, there's the fact that Iran, as a nation, has very few friends around the world, and the list has got shorter, I would say, in the last couple of years. So do they really have any capacity to fix those underlying economic problems and address those grievances?
Yes, you're correct that there are some structural and problems in Iran based on misalignment of its role in the world economy. It would naturally be an economic partner of the West, sending energy and other resources to the West in return for industrial goods, but it's reoriented itself towards Russia and China, which is less helpful for its development. There are internal problems with price controls, problems with corruption, problems with really rent taking. That is, you have privileged elites who exploit their monopoly or connections with the leadership to gain excessive rents from their activities and impoverishing the people. But some of the problems can be addressed, and this is the puzzle we have in the West. If Iran would do much better if it would get the sanctions relieved, and the best way to do that is to just renounce the nuclear program. It's now gotten Iran entangled in wars last year. It's hurt the economy for years. And so any rational cost benefit analysis would say that at least for now, they could just shelve the nuclear program. But their stubborn adherence to it just leaves everyone doubting what's the intent, what's the purpose of this commitment.
All right, let's just talk for a moment about alternatives to the current leadership. We've heard President Trump in the last 24 hours sort of openly doubting the capacity of Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah, to lead. I don't know what you think about him and how much support you think he has, or whether you think there are any other credible opposition movements or an umbrella group that perhaps people of all walks of life in Iran could rally behind.
Right. So inside Iran, of course, it's hard to know. There may be groups, but it seems the level of repression is fairly high. So if it's not clear there's what the alternative leadership would be. And that's in contradistinction to what we had before the 79 revolution, where the clerical establishment led by Ayatollah Khamenei were able to build basically a parallel structure inside the country as well as outside. There are leaders on the outside. You mentioned the Shah, the would-be crown prince, the son of the former Shah. His influence within the country is unknown. There were some protesters calling for his return, but that might have been just to antagonize the regime, which of course would consider him anathema. It's not clear what kind of experience or backing he has. There are some more leftist groups. They were very active in waging a terrorism campaign inside Iran in the 80s. They seem to have been less influential now. So that is very unclear who would replace the current leadership. It would most likely come, or could possibly come, from the military. I mean, you have a strong leader in the IRGC who would de facto take control. And then it would be an outright military leadership, as you've seen in some of the neighboring countries.
Okay, and just lastly, Richard, I mean, looking ahead to where things head to from here, I mean, if we talk about where we might be 6 months down the road, do you think regime collapse or a harsher, more militarized Iranian regime is more likely? Which of those two scenarios would you err towards?
Right, hazardous to guess, but I would say in that 6 months, it's probably going to be a more repressive version, if that's possible, of the current approach. That is, the regime seems to feel very beleaguered. As we mentioned, they're going to undergo a transition, at least at the top, and when the supreme leader transfers power to his successor. The country, as you mentioned, doesn't have a lot of foreign friends at the moment. So I think in the short term, it's going to become more repressive. But longer term, this strikes me as just being an unnatural political leadership for the Iranian people who would want a more liberal democratic regime. It's an unnatural geopolitical stance being focused towards Russia and China as opposed to the West, or even more so the neighboring countries in the Middle East. So I think the long-term prospects of the current regime are small. But in the next 6 months, it looks like they'll stay in office.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us and sharing your expertise with us. Richard White, security analyst and senior fellow at the NATO Defense College. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you for hosting me.